Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. I am Jeremy Nettles, the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can give us a call or a text at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. That's our website, riverridgechurch.org, and if you go there, you can find all sorts of links. You can get to our Facebook page, also to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is where we stream all of our Sunday morning worship services. Quick public service announcement here from future Jeremy. And yes, I did freeze frame it on the most unflattering image of myself that I could find. I figured if you can't laugh at yourself, then at least let somebody else do it. When I recorded this video, the only way that we were doing our worship services was over the YouTube live stream. There were only a handful of us in the building, no more than absolutely necessary because, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, since that time, things have been looking up a little bit. We're still not out of the woods, and we can't say that it's time to just go ahead and fling open the doors and have at it in the way that we normally would, but we are opening up the building for some limited in-person worship. If you would like to participate in that and would like to join us, then please try to get in touch with us. You can use the phone number or the email address that I've already mentioned here, and we will be glad to get you up to speed on all of the sort of parameters that we put in place and the measures that we have taken. I can say quickly here that we are recommending strongly that everybody wear masks. It's not just for your own safety, it's a lot more for the safety of others, because if you or I or somebody else is infected, then we don't actually know. We were probably going to be asymptomatic, at least for the first couple of weeks, and so we don't want to be spreading around whatever horrible germs we might have to those of our congregation who are a little bit more vulnerable. So, of course, if you have any inkling that you yourself might be sick, especially if you have a slightly elevated temperature, then we would request that you stay home until you are feeling better and then try to join us. And even if you are feeling in tip-top condition, please do bring a mask with you. We don't have masks to share for everybody, but we are trying to take measures and get people back to worshiping in person. You know, now that I've looked at this image of myself for a minute and a half, I feel like I kind of look high. Well, what are you going to do? All right, back to the show. And if you would like to go there, you could join us for our worship, and you could also find our backlog both of worship services and of Bible studies and TV programs too. Hopefully the resources that you can find both on the YouTube channel and on the website will be very beneficial to you. If you go to the website, you can also find all sorts of links and articles and study materials and all that kind of thing. We also do a radio show every Sunday afternoon. That's at 2 p.m. on 98.5 FM. You can also find it on 1400 AM, and we'd appreciate if you join us for that as well if you're getting something out of these TV episodes. I covered John chapter 5 and the end of chapter 4 with you on this program a couple of weeks ago, and in that section we saw Jesus healing, and then we also saw him being rejected, and we saw the conflict that arose between Jesus and the Jewish authorities over something rather silly, and we also saw that he had this very long speech in chapter 5, and he addressed those who were sort of harrying and poking him, and by the end we noticed kind of a sad outlook where those who are praising Moses are rejecting Moses' prediction of Jesus. Well, this time we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to cover the first part of John chapter 6. We covered much of the second half of John chapter 6 in another installment on the bread that is a part of the Lord's Supper, and we'll cover that again sometime, but we certainly didn't fully consider the context, and we didn't really talk much about the first half of that chapter either. It is a long chapter, and there's too much for us to realistically get through in one sitting here, but as we go through this chapter, at least the first portion of it, we're going to focus on the miracles that Jesus performs, and then we will begin to get into the teaching that he followed up with after the miracles. So let's start in John chapter 6, verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. We should stop there for a moment to consider what's going on here. There's a bit of a shift in the narrative structure here at this point. There's a temporal break. after this, Jesus went up. This is not the first time that John has done this. He began chapter 5 that way as well. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. The trouble is that this phrase, after this, doesn't really give us any clue as to how long has passed between the previous statement and the current time, but we do get a little bit of a clue this time in verse 4. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now, it's not exactly clear, even so, how much time had passed between this and the previous chapter, but there is clearly a different setting between the previous chapter and this one, and it certainly suggests that some significant time has passed. So let's pick up at verse 2. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." So let's talk for a moment about the location here. We already read in verse 1 that it's the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. If you're not too familiar with the geography of Israel, that's up toward the north. So picture the Mediterranean Sea on the left-hand side on the west, and then the Jordan River as the boundary on the right-hand side on the east. At the south end of the Jordan River is the Dead Sea, and at the north end of the Jordan River is the Sea of Galilee, and then between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is the land of Israel. So we're up in the northern part of the land of Israel, and this is basically where Jesus grew up and where he spent most of his time. This area is, sort of mountainous. It says that he went up on a mountain in verse 3. By our standards, they might be more like large hills. They're not exactly the Himalayas, but they are enough to make him visible above the others. And to the people of that area, they're what they would call the mountains. Now, we might well ask, why in the world did Jesus have a crowd following him? And John sort of anticipates that and immediately answers it for us. They were following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. So they have something to gain from this whole thing. This is the same thing that we saw back in chapter 4, verse 48, where Jesus told the crowd, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." Now, it's a start. They're following him because of the signs. It's a start, but it's not really enough. Now, why does John mention that it is the Passover feast that's at hand? It doesn't really figure into the ensuing story, and it's not mentioned again. Is it just a temporal marker to say, oh yeah, this is the time of year when it occurred? If that's the case, then why? There's not really any need to give that information. There's no real reason for him to share that. Well, it's because of the bread from heaven that Jesus was about to get. The whole chapter focuses on bread, and it culminates in Jesus calling himself the bread of life. So he asks Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? And it says that he is testing Philip, but it's not that he's testing him in sort of a jerky way. He's not looking to scoff at him for giving the wrong answer. He's not looking to deduct points if Philip doesn't answer exactly correctly. He's just trying to get Philip thinking. He wants to challenge him a little bit and see how far Philip is able to reason on his own. And Philip's answer, of course, is like, well, I mean, that's going to be awfully expensive. We can't afford to do that. 200 denarii, by the way, probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, and it doesn't really make any sense for us to try to assign a dollar value to it because the economies that we're talking about are just so completely different. We've got one economy that's based around both goods and services, but around one economic system, and then you've got this other economy that's primarily based around agriculture, and there's money that changes hands, and there's a lot of similarities, but there are so many vast differences that it just doesn't work to try to compare. But you can at least get a rough idea of what kind of expense we're talking about here by knowing that the denarius was the average daily rate for a working class man. So essentially what we're talking about is the average working class man's 8 months' wages. And Philip said that would not be enough to buy enough for everyone in this crowd to get even a little bit of bread. Well, another one of the disciples, Andrew, has at least some idea and says, well, I mean, we've got some bread here, but obviously it's nowhere near enough for this many people. And there's one little detail that's thrown in here, that they are barley loaves. Now, that sounds like it's just a throwaway, it doesn't really matter, but barley, how often do you eat barley loaves? Well, barley is kind of the poor man's wheat. It's easier to grow, but it tends to be cheaper, it's a lower quality, it's not as desirable, it's not as enjoyable. And so the fact that these were barley loaves just highlights the nature of this crowd. These people were poor. The best that they had on hand right then was this, kind of poor substitute for wheat. They had 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish. Well, Jesus takes this piddly amount of food, and then my favorite part about this whole thing is that in verse 11, he took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them. He gave thanks for this tiny little amount of food that was obviously not enough. Can you imagine doing that? Do you give thanks when you clearly don't have enough? That's a different kind of attitude, isn't it? But that's what Jesus is displaying here. And then he distributes out this food, and it manages to feed everybody. Now, just consider for a moment that this only takes us a few seconds to read and to think about, but surely some time passed. This was probably an affair of at least many minutes, if not on the order of a couple of hours, before everybody got this food passed around and was able to sit and eat it. Now, the amount of time that it took is not really the point. It has more to do with the miracle that had been performed. But I think that it's easy for us to gloss over the importance of this miracle and to gloss over just how stunning that would have been for these people who actually sat there and lived through this scenario. Now, I've heard some explanations about this that say, well, it was just that they all shared it equally and that no miracle actually occurred. But regardless of how ridiculous that sounds on the face of it, considering that it would be like less than 1 crumb apiece, the fact that they came up with 12 baskets of fragments from 5 barley loaves and 2 fish makes it pretty obvious that this was something miraculous and not just that they all managed to share between 5,000 people. I remember an occasion where one of my annoying relatives was telling me a story about the most powerful Jedi ever. I don't know, it was based on some ridiculous fan fiction or something, and it was as if he didn't realize that whoever was responsible for writing this trash could make up whatever he or she wanted because there were no limits aside from the writer's own imagination. And of course, when that happened, the childish part of me wanted to respond with something like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to write a story about one who's even more powerful than that. And then, made up some inane feat of strength or power or whatever to somehow win this silly competition. But of course, with my luck, he probably would have taken it seriously and then I would have had to follow through on it. So perhaps it's best for everyone that instead of going with my childish impulses, I just stared blankly at him. The point is, no matter how big the feat, no matter how powerful the miracle performed, how incredible it is, it's not impressive in that case because there's no hurdle to be overcome because it's not real. But imagine if it was. To these people that Jesus had just fed, it was more than just another meal is to you or to me. We take for granted that food is plentiful and relatively inexpensive. Obesity is more of a problem in this country than hunger. That's not to say that no one ever goes hungry, but the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be overweight or obese. And that's the only time in history that that's ever happened. It was the opposite for these people. For these people, food was everything. It was a daily struggle. These were people who had to work their butts off day in and day out to eke out a living, hopefully to have enough food to feed everybody, and maybe have enough left over to use as seed for next year's planting season. It was difficult. It was a struggle. It was a never-ending fight for survival just to have enough food. Now imagine being in that sort of a situation. It's more than just some made-up story. It's more than just some arcane hierarchy of fictional powers. This was a game changer. These people probably couldn't have even imagined a more meaningful demonstration of power and love than what Jesus provided. This was, in a very real way, sustaining and even saving lives and giving them precious sustenance that really meant something to them. And while this loving miracle did produce belief in them, it also provided an impetus for people's true colors to come out. That's where we pick up in verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now you might ask, why didn't he just let them hail him as king? I mean, isn't he the king of the earth? That's his whole purpose for being here, right? And yet, the day ends in deliberate solitude instead of the loving adulation from his adoring subjects. Because it wasn't the right time, and it wasn't the right way for him to be hailed as king. They didn't really understand, as we will see later on in this chapter. They have an entirely fleshly affinity for Jesus at this point. They're looking only at what he can give them, not what he expects of them, and they don't even understand his greatest gift. They haven't thought about the freedom from sin that Jesus is offering them. For these poor, hungry people, it was just about the food. Now there's some parallelism here between these poor people that Jesus has fed and the Israelites as they left Egypt. That's part of why John brings up the Passover, but in that instance, God had so much more in store for these people. He had a covenant and righteousness and a homeland and a loving, meaningful relationship between God and a nation. But all they could think about was where their next meal would be coming from. So there's a similar response here to Jesus as his Father got all those years before. God provides the food, and they like it, they appreciate it, but they end up complaining shortly thereafter that he isn't giving them more, that he isn't giving them exactly what they want. We will see that in these very people by the end of today's text. Let's read verses 16 through 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Why did they leave him like that? It seems rather strange that he goes on the mountain and they just ditch him and get in the boats that presumably he had taken across the sea and just leave him there. Well, it doesn't say directly, but it seems fairly obvious that Jesus had told them to do that. Presumably that was an instruction, and it's not all that surprising considering the circumstances. His intent here is to get away from the crowd for a while. And so having his disciples get in the boats and leave would be a fairly good way to throw them off of his tracks. But the story doesn't end here with him in solitude on the mountain. After he has spent some time with his Father, he performs another miracle, demonstrates his power over the natural world in a similar way to what he did with the food. This time, though, there's a different response. Before, the crowds were very appreciative, and they basically called him the Christ, and they were looking to make him king. This time, his disciples are frightened at the power that he displays. But then he alleviates that fright with a simple phrase, "It is I." In Greek, that's ego eimi, I am, as in the name of God, which he gave to Moses to carry back to the Israelites. It's not all that clear when Jesus means it in this sense, when he is recalling that instance back in Exodus chapter 3, and when it's just a common phrase, because the phrase I am does pop up fairly often. But eventually, he is clearly intending it to be heard this way. By the time we get to chapter 8, verse 58, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," he clearly intends for it to be seen as equation with God. At this point, perhaps he is sort of innocuously slipping in that phrase and softly suggesting it in the minds of his disciples. Pick up in verse 22. On the next day, the crowd that remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Other boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. Why are they following him like this? Why are they essentially pursuing him? They're trying to chase him down. Well, the text doesn't directly tell us yet, but we can surmise that they don't want to lose access to this great resource that they have found. But why do they view him in that way? We would hope that they would be after his teaching, the spiritual food that he was providing, and his healing, and especially the spiritual healing, and his instructions in righteousness, all that sort of thing. But the bread is first in their minds. Verse 25. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus then said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." So our suspicions were correct, unfortunately. And Jesus is disappointed too. They're really just after the bread. And many people even today do seek Jesus in this way. They're after some material benefit. But that's not really what Jesus' greatest promise is. They might very well reap some material benefit from him, but should that really be the reason for following him? If the material is all that we have, then it's all meaningless. That's the food that perishes, as Jesus has called it here. Jesus says to them and to us that we should work for the food that endures. And that starts with belief in God's Son and obedience to His will. Now, they don't see that far. They just say, oh, well, show us a sign then. Of course, they're trying to use His own words, because He'd said back up in verse 25, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. And so it's as if they're saying, oh, well, sure, by all means, just show us a sign then. They're trying to essentially trick Him into giving them what they want, which is food. It's easy for us to disparage these people over this in our time of relative excess and obesity, but hunger was the main daily problem for these people. It shortened their lives, either directly or indirectly. Now, we have our own fleshly concerns that distract us from the spiritual, and right now we'd probably all be after His healing, and we might neglect the spiritual because we're so interested in His physical healing. So Jesus' response to these people then applies to us as well. Even if you're not descended from the nation of Israel, still the same basic principle applies, that God did provide for your ancestors one way or another, and He's also provided for you the best, the only real food, which doesn't just sustain physical life, but gives life that isn't doomed to an eventual end, a life that transcends. Our response to Him should be the same as what the crowds give Him in verse 34, Sir, give us this bread always. When they said that, though, they didn't fully understand. You don't fully understand either. Neither do I. None of us fully understands Jesus. But He has shown us in ways that give us the gist, that approximate what He really has to offer. He's shown us what He really wants for us and from us. Do you desire more of Him? Now, this story doesn't end here, but it's a good place for us to stop and to reflect on our own lives, to reflect on whether we desire Jesus and whether we desire the food that perishes or the food that endures, whether we are focusing our lives on the physical or on the spiritual, whether we're hoping to reap some material benefit from Jesus, or whether we accept those blessings with thanksgiving, but are a lot more interested in the spiritual life that He has to offer. We'll pick up and finish the chapter in a week or two, but in the meantime, I'd like for you to consider these things that we have discussed further. And think about what you desire from Jesus, whether it is physical or spiritual, and whether Jesus would approve of the type of food that you're working for. This program is presented by the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can give us a call or a text at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. We would love to hear comments or questions, and we would love to help you with whatever your spiritual needs are. I hope that you've gotten something worthwhile out of this look at John 6, and I hope that you will join us again next time for Iron Sharpens Iron.